John chapter 20, verses 19 through 23. Hear the word of the Lord. When it was evening on that day, the first day of the week, and the doors of the house where the disciples had met were closed for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." After he said this, he showed them his hands and his side. And the disciples rejoiced when they saw the Lord. And Jesus said to them again, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I send you." When he had said this, he breathed on them and said to them, "Receive the holy breath. If you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven. If you retain the sins of any, they are retained." The word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
What we think, what we project, often controls our lives. Walter Winchell is often credited with a poem that begins by saying, "If you think you were beaten, you are. If you think you dare not, you don't. If you like to win, but you think you can't, it's almost certain you won't." What we think and expect matters if for no other reason than expectation limits the range of actions we are willing to take. When it comes to God being present in our lives, granted freely to all disciples, what results do we expect as a consequence? Does receiving God's breath into our lives make a difference? When we think of Pentecost, our attention points us to Acts chapter 2, where God's breath dramatically came down upon the disciples gathered on the rooftop of a house there in Jerusalem. It's a scene made for the movie screen, with displays of power, flames of fire, extraordinary action. While we do well to link to that special day the annual Feast of First Fruits, 50 days after Passover, Pentecost is more than that. The granting of God's breath, God's presence within and among us, is not limited to that event in all its eye-catching display. John records this other, much calmer moment when Jesus communicated God's breath to and upon the disciples. It's not only in times of extraordinary events, moments of high emotion, times where crowd-wowing moments chock full of wonder that God's breath and presence invade our lives. It's not just in those moments that grab our attention and we want to write home about. It's also in the calm, the quiet, the hidden away moments when we are seemingly alone, where we are hidden behind locked doors. In fact, there are no rules for when the breath of the Holy One is with us. Well, maybe there's one rule here. If we belong to God, God's breath lives in and within us. Always. There's a sense in which this was ever the case among the people of Israel. We read of the psalmist's words talking about hiding from God's breath being impossible. Whether he climbed to the highest heights of heaven or made his bed in the underworld of Sheol, God was there. We're not given an exact definition of how what Jesus was announcing was different than this. We really only have hints that God's breath is now granted to all, not simply to God's anointed prophet or king. We have the hint that this indwelling is now constant and no longer sporadic as the Hebrew Scriptures tend to portray. The other main distinction is that in light of Jesus' life and ministry, we can now better understand God's breath and how God seeks to operate in our lives. We still mix our language with older concepts about God's breath. You know, the spiritual that we sang this morning. Every time I feel the Spirit moving in my heart, I will pray. I grew up with that song, as most likely the majority of you did. As much as I enjoy that song, there are a couple of things that strike me a little bit off with the lyrics. First of all, what I feel has no bearing on the presence of God's breath within or around me. Secondly, where we find the Spirit was moving the prophets, Paul, Peter, and other leaders of the church, it tells us that as they were moved, they spoke or acted. They did not revert to prayer, but rose to action. The empowering of the Spirit, God's breath in us, is not for our personal, internal use. The breath of God enables us to speak and accomplish God's will beyond our human limitations. As Matthew records Jesus announcing God's coming breath, he sent the disciples. He told them that they would receive power to be witnesses before all the world. The focus is not inward. The focus is outward, onward, forward, into the purposes of God. Here in John, receiving God's breath is followed with a charge of action for the disciples. It's a charge of great responsibility. It's a charge to represent God's grace for forgiveness, for inclusion, for bringing people into God's reign. It was a counterpoint to their fear. These disciples were still hiding from their compatriots. They were terrified by their uncertainties and insecurities. They were concerned about what would happen to them if they should show themselves in public. Would the same crowds and leaders call for their deaths as well? Would they be run out of town? Would they be asked questions they did not know how to answer? Would they be ridiculed or laughed at? How are they going to make sense of Jesus' death and when it did not match up to any of their expectations of Messiah? How could they explain to others what they did not understand? What if people just treated them as fools? How could they show their faces in public amid all the what-ifs? Fear had taken away hope. Fear had obscured that there is more to life than the failures, tragedies, pain, and chaos we can so nimbly project outward. The vast majority of those fears are rather pointless and empty. It's kind of like the parishioner who told me that she worried about everything. It was her insurance policy in life. If she worried about it, it would never come to pass. It's the things she didn't think to worry about that bothered her. The things that she overlooked. We don't even know how to fear correctly. So what's the point? Jesus' recipe to bring the disciples out of their fear was twofold. He told them to be at peace, thus giving them a measure of reassurance. Secondly, he granted them God's very breath, thereby rekindling hope. We don't often know how to define hope. It's not something we easily understand. Hope is not knowing that everything will turn out roses. We know it won't. Hope is not believing nothing can or will go wrong. It does. Hope is not that God has some hidden reason behind everything we experience. God never explained anything to Job. Hope is not expecting God to protect us from all and any harm. Hope is rather that come what may, God is with us. We are not alone. There is more to be written, and God will be there to help with the writing. God is there to pick up the pieces, because God is already with us, right here, right now. That means I don't need all the answers. It means I don't need to predict which storm is on its way, how it will arrive, or what damage I will sustain. Rather, it means that whatever storm comes my way, God is yet with me. In God's presence and under God's care, I can be secure, no matter what uncertainties I face. Because God is with me, I need not hide behind closed doors in fear of all those things that might go wrong. In fear of so much that is simply out of my control. Because God is with me, I can take on the mission and tasks set before me in confidence. It's not confidence in myself. It's trust in God. God whose very breath is already within me. It's trust in the God who claims me as God's own. I can't tell you all the details of what went on with the disciples the rest of that evening or over the next few days. I can say that not long afterwards, Jesus found them fishing. They had left the closed doors behind. They'd stepped back into life's routines, even as they pondered the upheaval in their world. I can say that instead of hiding behind closed doors on the day of Pentecost, we find them gathered on a rooftop in Jerusalem in front of God and everyone. Visible to the crowds in the streets below. I can tell you that as God's breath was poured out upon them in a visible manner, they did not shrink back from the crowds. Rather, they answered those who shouted questions or mocked or jeered what they did not understand. Impelled and directed by God's breath moving among and within, they announced what God was doing so that all might hear. They trusted God's presence within them to fulfill the task Jesus had given them, saying, "You will receive power when God's breath comes upon you, and you will be my witness." Their lives were transformed. What has been the result in our lives?